Oh, yeah,
Tomorrow
well,
is the 15th.
are they 5-inch heels?
No, I know, I
You know
saw
what I'm
that, yeah,
referring
I do
to?
know what you're referring to.
Yeah, okay.
As long as you can run in them.
Or after 4.
Well, remember
What did you
the
say,
old
can you do 4?
famous line about
Yeah,
Ginger
I can do
Rogers
4.
dancing
Okay.
with Fred
I'll
Astaire?
put down
Are you aware of that? Ginger Rogers could do everything Fred Astaire could do,
But she could.
but in high heels
Right.
and backwards.
Oh, and backwards, that's
Yeah,
for the.
and backwards.
Okay,
If you ever watch them,
yeah.
she could do it in high heels and backwards, yes.
Sorry.
Okay,
All right, let's get rocking.
yeah, good morning, everyone. Welcome to another meeting of the Montgomery County Chamber's Infrastructure and Land Use Committee, which is chaired by Gus Bauman from the law firm Beveridge and Diamond and Bob Elliott from Lantian Development. Gus and Bob, let's just, jump right, well, I did want to give a commercial actually for our next.
For the next meeting.
Yeah, so we have another exciting meeting, next on December 12th. That's with the new State Highways Administrator, Will Pine. So, Will was just appointed to that position, Gus, in August,
I mean, it was just
a
happened.
minute ago.
Yeah. So we'll be here
William.
virtually.
Fine.
He can't be here physically in Rockville, so we have to do it all virtual.
But, he's gonna have a lot of interesting things to say about,
Oh, some minor projects in the county.
minor projects that are already approved by the federal government, things like that. So, that's an exciting one again. So that's December 12th. And that one is not at our usual 8:30. That one is at 9:30.
Yes, correct,
9:30. So,
correct.
you can find that, more information on our website. Many of you here probably got a calendar invite as well. So I just wanted to talk about that one. And actually, I'll just talk about another committee meeting we have this week on Thursday at 8:30. That's sort of what's next for local and state policy. That's with another government employee. That is with Melanie Wenger. Melanie's Director of Intergovernmental Relations or Affairs for the county. She has an interesting role where she is essentially a lobbyist for both the executive branch and the legislative branch. So she's going to talk about the priorities for the county
Right,
from the perspective of both of those.
right. And since she represents both the executive and the council, I refer to Melanie as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
There you go.
There you go. Okay.
Well, so Gus and Bob, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and we'll do quick introductions so that our speakers can know who is virtual on the line, as well as the people sitting here at the table. My name is Gus Bauman of the Beveridge and Diamond firm, and we're very happy to have today Pam Dunn and Ndou, I want to pronounce it right.
Livhu
Ndou.
Yep.
Of council staff. And Livhu is the new attorney. I call you the new attorney there.
She's been here how many years?
It's been a year now?
3 years.
3 years. But the pandemic changed everything because you never met people physically.
This is true.
And so when things happen during the pandemic, you're just like, you're brand new. And Pam Dunn, is, council staff, in charge of planning and land use. And, before that was at Park and Planning for many years. So, you know, they bring all kinds of varying perspectives. And what we're here today to talk about is what's going on at the council, to the extent they're willing to say it out loud. And what we do is Pam has to leave at 9:10 for a council meeting, but we have you until 10 o'clock. Our meetings end no later than 10. If we get done before, great. We hear from our speakers, comments and questions from the group. I'm gonna turn this over to Bob, and then we can, and then we can hear from everybody and launch right into you guys.
So,
Great.
Good morning, Bob Elliott with Lantian, local developer. For everybody who is online, the thing to always remember, it's the bottom of your screen. I believe it's under reactions. If you would like us to call on you, please raise your hand so that we can see you, because we don't necessarily always know that you want to speak, because you will largely be on mute most of the time.
Brian, is
So,
that your thing?
And then we are going to do a quick around the room introductions, and then so that you all hear who we are, and then Brian will call you out individually, do a quick introduction. So with that, well, Brian just got up, so we'll go across the table.
Sure. Hi, I'm Liz Rogers with Clerk Julie and Brewer.
And also remember to look that way too. Good morning.
Yeah, which way are you gonna look?
Good morning, Stuart Barr with Lurch, Early and Brewer, land use and zoning attorney. Thank you to both of you for joining the chamber this morning. Really appreciate it.
And Steve Robbins, also with Lurch Early. Good to see you.
And I was Brian Levine. I'm with the Montgomery County Chamber of Commerce. And so let's do introductions on the screen, and I will start with my boss, Gigi Godwin. Gigi, go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Gigi Godwin, President and CEO of the Chamber. It's great to see you all, and thank you to our speakers for joining us. We much appreciate it.
Jerry, why don't you go next?
Good morning, everyone. Jerry Sanford. I'm the Managing Director of Business and Economic Development for the Harbor Bank of Maryland.
And it says Jerry's Otter Pilot on there. That is his AI note taker. Mel, hey, Mel, I saw you pop up. Go ahead, Mel.
There we are. Hi, I'm Mel Tall with Lee Development Group. It's good to see you all and talk about what's happening in this great county. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman of the Board Emeritus.
Good morning, Lowell Yoder, M&T Bank.
Casey Anderson, who you may know.
Casey Anderson, Rogers Consulting. I'm on the road, so I'm not going to turn on the camera, but nice to see you, even if you can't see me.
Susan?
Hey, good morning, everybody. Susan Madden from Montgomery College. It's nice to be with you, and I'm on the road like Casey.
Good morning, Susan. Board Member Katie McAvoy.
Hi, good morning. Katie McAvoy from AT&T.
I see a Kay Fry on there. Who is that?
Good morning. My name is Kevin Fry. I'm with Crown Castle.
Morning, Kevin. Let's stick with Crown Castle and go with Ann. Morning, Ann.
Hi, good morning, Brian. Thank you so much. Ann Brooks with Crown Castle. Definitely a self-defined planning nerd, so interested in this conversation this morning for more than professional reasons. Good to see everyone.
I believe her. Danielle, and then Ashley. Danielle Friedman with Pepco, and go ahead, Ashley.
Good morning, everybody. Ashley Bagwell with Harris Jones and Malone.
And Chuck.
Good morning, everyone. Chuck Connor with Venable.
And last but not least, another board member of ours, Scott. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Scott. Oh, there's another one. Go ahead, Scott.
Good morning. Scott Wallace, I'm a land use attorney with Miles and Stockbridge.
And I see Leslie joining. Leslie's actually the chair of our Legislative Affairs Committee, which is hosting Melanie this week. Leslie, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, good morning. Leslie Weber. Nice to see you all.
And I believe that's everyone, Mr. Chair and Mr. Co-Chair.
All right, let's go.
Okay. Well, good morning, and thank you for inviting us. So as Gus mentioned, I cover land use for the County Council, which means anything coming through from the Planning Department, the Parks Department. Livhu and I sometimes work together when it is related to zoning. And we were the two staff people that staffed the State Development Review Process Working Group that convened all summer, many hours. All of it recorded, so for your viewing pleasure, you could go back and watch it. And the group came up with, I think it was 22 recommendations. And it was really focused on streamlining the development review process, although there was also quite a bit of interest in public input and transparency and coordination between agencies. So I would say those are the three big things. It was streamlining, coordination amongst agencies, and transparency for community members. So they came up, and this group, if you're not aware of it, was facilitated by Delegate Leslie Lopez. And so she chaired it. We had a facilitator who was from Public Engagement Associates. He did an amazing job. It was important because there were stakeholders from the County Council, from the executive branch. You had The department heads of DEP, DPS, DOT, you had two from the county executive's office. You had two people from Park and Planning, a Parks employee. There were a lot. There were two community representatives. There were two development community representatives. So bringing everyone together to say, let's look at the development review process, not just from planning, but from like literally the filing of an application until you can actually put a shovel in the ground. Let's look at this and figure things out. So at the end of the day, the first thing we had to do is figure out what statewide changes were relevant, because that's what Delegate Lopez wanted to be able to take back to the Legislative Assembly. If you don't know, they've come out with the whole list of proposed legislation for the bi-county and Maryland and Montgomery County, that delegation. We got a posting of it yesterday. Anyway, so at least 3 of them are from her, because that's what we came up with in the working group. And they had to do with syncing the state highway review with MCDOT's review timeline of 30 days. And I think a state highway had 45 days. So occasionally, again, that would hold things up by a couple weeks. Doesn't sound like much, but again, if things can get changed to make more efficiencies, that's what we were really charged with doing. The other was to change a state law that would allow the planning board conditional approval of plats, so that that process could be sped up sometimes by weeks or months. It would allow the planning board approval of a plat while the plat is being circulated for signatures and other administrative tasks. And that was, again, a long conversation about people vacationing or people doing things and being gone for 2 to 3 weeks at a time, not getting a signature, it itself holding up the plat. And then last was to really move into exploring digital signatures and digital plats and getting away from the Mylars. And again, that could really help save time. So those are all state level changes, and they're in the works.
Just to interrupt, I just wanted to let everyone know that the chamber took a position last December on a couple of bills introduced by Senator Kramer that we had issue with. And it's sort of, I think, some of those discussions and that hearing led to the creation of Delegate Lopez's task force. So
yes,
we're very pleased to see that result, as opposed to the bills that were introduced by Senator Kramer, which we opposed. So.
Correct. And so I would just high level, there were 3 other recommendations related to public notice, 2 related to the intake process, 1 for certified site plans, 3 were related to work that goes on at DPS, 2 for lead agency and interagency coordination, 1 recommendation for amendments in administrative plans, 5 related to public involvement, and then 2 are a little bit hard to categorize. 1 had to do with water and sewer category changes, kind of a soft recommendation, but it was really about pinging WSSC to try to process those as quickly as possible. They get held up. And then the last one had to do with follow-up. There were a lot of things we couldn't cover. Basically, we just didn't have the time. We had how many pages of spreadsheet? Livhu and I entered everything.
500 separate comments at least.
Yeah. So there were just
from like 40 different stakeholders.
There's some charge to go back, and we at least notified with every comment who was involved, so that if someone wanted to follow up, there's somebody that's been named as the follow-up agency. So that's the big level, that state. Again, I would recommend, if you haven't seen the state legislation that's right now on the table, it's there. There's a couple that are pretty interesting, so I won't go into details now, but it'll be an interesting conversation when you have Melanie here in a couple, 3 days. Yes, she does represent both the executive and the council, and when they do not agree, she basically follows it for the executive and the council. She does not actually advocate for one or the other, or she basically advocates for neither. So it makes for an interesting dynamic. Right now, for me, I have the Fairland and Brace Cheney plan going on. If you haven't been following it, it's gone through the Parks, Planning, Housing and Parks Committee completely. We're done. We start, that's why I'm leaving soon. We start this morning with the full council. We'll go through plan-wide recommendations today. There aren't any big highlights there that are controversial. There are a couple small things in the plan-wide recommendations, as usual. There's a couple properties or 2 that will be the focus of discussion. But that should get approved by the end of the month, I hope, or early in December. We'll get a resolution out to everybody. And hopefully it'll help spur some activity in the Fairland Briggs Cheney area. There's a lot more mixed use going in. There's the potential for a lot more housing. Even though they have a lot of housing out there, the idea is, obviously we're behind in housing construction, and then the zoning is mixed use to try to get a little bit of both, a little bit of retail to go in and support those communities. And last for me, I'm I'm gearing up for, well, the next master plan coming, just so you know, is a Tacoma Park minor master plan amendment. That should be coming over to council in December with a public hearing in January. And the council will take it up right before it gets too deep into the budget. If it's late, we will push it off until after budget. It's a big budget year. And then finally, I am talking with planning staff. They're gearing up and they're already starting their work on the growth and infrastructure policy. That policy is the APFO, that Public Facilities Ordinance regulations, primarily for schools and transportation. It is always done in the second year of a council session. So by law, the planning board must send it to the council by August 1st of that year, so in 2024. And the council either adopts it or the current one stays in place, but they have until November 15th to do that adoption. So that'll be a product coming over, and it always has a very short timeline for review at the council, given they receive it when they're on recess. We can at least notice the public hearing that way, but they really have September and October to go through it and get it done. And so what I've heard, this is what planning says they're doing for the growth and infrastructure policy this time, is examining the policy outcomes from last time to ensure that the tools are equitable, fair, and effective, ensuring that the policy helps reach the goals established in the general plan of Thrive, and analyzing the county's current growth trends. I have been told it's not going to be a complete rewrite of all of those rules and regulations, but really this examination to see how well are they working and how well do they further the goals of economic development, equity, and environmental resilience.
Will this be the first time that the new council takes up the growth and infrastructure policy?
Yes, because every council, seated council, takes it up once, right? It's in their second year. We have 6 new members, so for them, walking them through and teaching them about it. So good point, Gus. We'll probably do some tutorials for them. We do that when they first come in, but something like the growth and infrastructure policy is just a lot to handle, so we touch on it. So probably set those up maybe in
July?
Yeah, maybe June, like right after they get back from recess. Do some educational, like here's the groundwork, here's how the current works. Oh, and I'll mention, what is typical is they'll look at impact taxes when they look at the growth. They're not necessarily tied together. There's no legislation around the impact taxes. They aren't about adequacy. They're just taxes on development.
Right.
But it's always a good time to take a look at those and say, do they make sense? Are they based on the right things? Because they're usually calculated and based on similar metrics and constructs. We'll take a look at impact taxes at the same time if somebody doesn't pull them up before that. But
and can you touch on, please, for the folks who are listening, the involvement of the executive branch when the council takes up growth and infrastructure policy, how that works?
Right.
How you see that happening coming up?
So typically what will happen, I mean, it's the 2 areas. So we typically, in the school side of it, you'll get MCPS that will coordinate with the planning department to make sure that all of the data that is used and the metrics and then if you're talking impact taxes, the pricing of things are all accurate and adequate and fit with what they do. As far as MCDOT, they'll weigh in heavily with the planning board. So in the summer is when the growth and infrastructure policy is going to go through the planning board. So the process really is going to start for them publicly in May. You know, they're going to put out some very preliminary stuff in May, and the board's going to work through that in May and June. I think the board has to adopt a staff draft, has to be recognized by, I think, July 1st, so that the board has a solid month to approve that staff draft. So they'll be working closely with MCDOT through that because, you know, they have to coordinate the idea of like the traffic tests. Do they have the data for the test? What do they measure? How do they measure it? Who measures it? You know, what's the geography? All of that will be in coordination with MCDOT. If they disagree, they'll come sit with the council and talk to us there too to say, you know, we really considered X, but it ended up being approved as Y, and can we talk about that?
And Pam, the chamber, by the way, was invited to be on the planning's school technical advice.
Oh, great.
For that growth update. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Love it.
That stakeholder group. So
that'll be really important.
We're participating in part of the process as well.
And I think that's relatively new. So kudos to them that they started a stakeholder group for it. I don't think in the past we've done that. So I think that's great.
So reminder to everybody out there, online, if you've got questions, please youth reaction. Oh, Scott Wallace.
Good morning. Thanks. So Pam, can you talk a little bit about what I thought was a really interesting end to the Fairland Master Plan with the undergrounding of utilities and that discussion at the chamber? I'm sorry, at the council.
Yeah, I will try. Okay, the council hasn't approved that yet, but the committee, and I'm not following it as closely as my colleague. So Stephen Kenny is our new transportation analyst. He's here overlapping a little bit with Glenn Orland, but Glenn is actually really going to retire.
Oh, yeah.
In December. No.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, we've heard this.
But Stephen Kenny is now covering, so he did the master plan with me. And there's a recommendation in the master plan to underground utilities. And he looked at it, and then the fiscal impact statement got information on the cost of it. And what we brought up to the committee was, what we try to balance, especially as analysts, for me, looking at the plan is, we have this idea of how much we want economic development in the eastern part of the county. And yet we understand that they also want, a healthy environment, tree canopy, certain things in the housing, gathering places, the things you might think of as amenities, things you want the development community to provide, but you also want the economic development. So it's a fine line. And so we try to remind the committee as we go through, and, you have very visionary, interesting goals or recommendations and plans, but I think you have to be very careful that the recommendations aren't too stringent, and you will not get any development at all if you are not careful. So that was sort of the vein in which we looked at the undergrounding utilities, very concerned that this could be very onerous on development. We recommended language to soften it. I think at the end of the day, they did not take that up, that they felt planning said they had the ability to it's not a requirement, it's a recommendation in a master plan, and they would not feel they had to enforce it if a developer said that it was not feasible. We wanted languages that said, we're feasible, to have that discussion at the board, let's have a conversation whether this is really feasible or not feasible. Because if not, and you really do want it, then it should be on the public sector to help work with this. This whole idea of creating communities has got to be about these collaborations with the development community. And anyway, so we'll see where the council lands on it. They haven't discussed it yet.
So the reason,
yeah.
The reason
Yes,
I wanted the reason I wanted Pam to talk a little bit about it, because I think it was an excellent effort by Pam and her colleague to bring in some economic development reality to the master plan process. So kind of following up on that is, Pam, where you obviously have a mandate to do that from a council member or something, that's great. But is there a role for the development community to also try to get that in there through you? We're always happy to help support your efforts in that regard. So, if you ever feel like you need some input to get something like that in there for discussion, we understand there's, you got to count to 6 now. So, but still.
No, I mean, Scott, I appreciate that. And it's interesting that we sometimes don't think to reach out, to just even get the temperature of groups like you to say, hey, this is there. If you're interested or you have a feeling, you should write in. I'm never going to tell somebody what they need to respond or write in about or how they feel about it. But just even making sure your antenna's up on it.
Right.
I will tell you at the end of the day, if you are still interested in this, it's never done until the council votes on it. Right. It doesn't even matter if it's a unanimous decision. And that is even stronger now. We are coming out of committees with a committee recommendation of 3 council members to an 11-member council.
Yeah.
When it was a 9-member council, that held a certain weight. Even that wasn't a done deal. But with an 11-member council, I've seen some pretty big changes. And with the Silver Spring Plan, we saw a very big one on the very last day at adoption. They changed the boundary because the community kept weighing in. They finally got the attention of a council member who basically wrote to his colleagues and said, at the end of the day, I just really can't do this boundary. And they basically said, fine. And they all unanimously agreed to the change, although it had been before them 4 times. It was very surprising.
Nothing like that Democratic primary vote out of Silver Spring.
I'm just saying.
I think what Scott also raises an interesting challenge for us is because we continue to put forth legislation that may be great in concept, but when you think about Montgomery County and the state and you think about our region and Washington, D.C. and Virginia, what we don't do enough of is benchmark. I'm talking about benchmarking against Maryland. For us, it's really important to benchmark against Virginia, Washington, D.C., because our boundaries and our borders are right there, and we do things time and again that make us unappealing to the development community. Oh, you want underground utilities? Virginia doesn't require that. D.C. obviously is a little bit of a different animal, but if you don't actually look at what's going on or why people, and that's why I think adding language like that makes a lot of sense, but I would just tell you, I feel like I'm a broken record in having to remind people of this, but it is so important to look beyond the state, particularly for us, because we are impacted by, we compete with Fairfax and Arlington and Alexandria, and they have choices, and businesses have choices, developers have choices on where they choose to build housing. And it's no surprise that for years we didn't get as much housing as North Virginia because rather than actually building MPDUs, they let you kick it into a fund. And for years, everybody would say, oh, I can build over here easy. I don't have to actually worry about building units. And they've now changed that because what they recognized is they weren't actually building units. Everybody was just contributing. But if the impact taxes remain higher, people look at the impact tax, right? So it's just all of this just consistently, every time we think about this, when we talk about, what should be happening with the, whatever, we're no longer calling it the subdivision staging.
Growth and infrastructure.
Growth and infrastructure, whatever we're calling it now. When you start talking about impact taxes, it is really important to look, we have some of the highest.
Across the region.
Look across the region.
What is undergrounding utilities in other master plan areas?
So we had a chart in the staff report. This is the staff report for November 6th. If you're interested, you go to the committee, pull up November 6th. And we did have a chart that said this is the language in other master plans where I think out of 3 of the 4 other master plans, it was softer language. I think for one of them, it was, again, this idea of underground utilities. But like I said, the staff at the table will come to the table and say that we still have enough room, if it's in a master plan, to not make it an actual requirement. It'll depend on the application. I don't know.
I mean, the one thing I would say with that is I think there are past planning board cases, like I'm thinking of the MHP development in White Flint, where the planning board did wrestle with that, and it was an affordable housing development, and they found that the master plan language said underground utilities, and that their hands were tied in making the applicant underground utilities.
Oh, interesting.
Because the master plan language didn't include the if feasible, and they have to find that substantial.
So that's the opposite of what the committee heard.
Right.
So that's.
And if I could offer, if this helps you, language along these lines in federal environmental statutes, a common phrase that's used so that there's some practicality to such recommendations, if feasible and practicable. And those are 2 words that taken together allow for more flexibility for the situation sometimes. Just the thought.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, part of so the other side of this were, council members who said, we have an area out there that, the way they kept describing it was, like the giant shopping centers full of asphalt, not very nice. We want to create a better environment. We want a lot more trees, and the utility lines hamper not only the tree canopy that we'd like to create, and we want to create a lot more trails, paths, bikeways, pedestrian ways. So they felt they were trade-offs. Again, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, it's just, I think on a property by property basis, you figure out what makes sense.
Those same underground utilities then also require going into the ground, which then impact tree pits, setback distances from everything else, and trying to build the same sort of things or within your right-of-ways or not within your right-of-ways, because you actually have to carve a path. You put a utility in, now all of a sudden, you can't build on top of it either. So it's great for a path, but it's not great for tree canopy. So you can have it both ways, just so everybody's clear about this.
And I think that part of the conversation doesn't come up either. So.
And then the other thing I'll just throw out, which is obvious to us, but maybe not to certain political people, which is if you're in a high demand growth area where everyone wants to be developing there, you can sometimes get away with a recommendation like that. If you're in an area like the East County, there is no way that is a high demand, high growth area. So to make such a recommendation is one more reason why that those acres of free parking will remain there for decades, because no one is going to dig them up. This is not White Flint, it's not downtown Bethesda, it's totally different, it's Fairland. And so everything will remain the same. They can put the language in the master plan, and I can guarantee you, from experience, nothing will happen.
And the other thing is, if you want to go back and look at history of what happened in this whole area, in my opinion, after hearing all this, the council, even though they probably don't know it, they're trying to shove off on the private sector and the development community to try to make something happen. How many years of the county ignoring the eastern part of the county on purpose, specifically because representation at that time wanted nothing to happen in the eastern part of the county. So now everyone sees this as sort of a fertile ground to make something happen and to correct the wrongs of what happened on the East County versus the West Side. I'm just saying this because I really believe this.
If it helps you at all, I was there chairing the planning board when we fought this, and the council at that time did what Steve said against the recommendations of the planning board. They put the East County into a development moratorium. They
Totally behind the eight ball.
And there were 2 council members on a 7-member council who wanted to do it, and the rest of them said, fine, you want to do that to the East County? We don't care. We'll spend money in the rest of the county. And that is what happened. And there are council members today, of the 11, maybe 1 knows this. The other 10 have no idea what they're dealing with. So to have a recommendation like this in the Fairland Master Plan will condemn that area to remaining the way it is until the next master plan. And you can relay that to who you answer to. If they want to talk with any of us, we can tell them that is what will happen, which is a shame. It's just a shame.
Well, and that's what really did happen. I mean, you can go back and look at the growth policies and moratoria, and it was, the East County was year after year in, certainly in commercial moratoria. That was absolutely off limits. Housing moratoria, difficult to get through, but some housing did get through.
And the council member who pushed it so hard, they have 2 major facilities in that part of the county named for her. I love the ironies of life. We have Pam for 4 more minutes before she has to go across the street to the council.
To talk about the Fairland.
And to talk about the Fairland plan. And she can say, you know, I just came over from the chamber and I heard the damnedest stories. But if they want to talk with any of us, we were there.
Right.
But before we take you up, any questions for our first speaker or comments before she has to go across the street?
More comments from online?
I mean, Pam, just on a positive note about the same thing, it's great that, I think it's great that the county is re-reviewing this and wants to see something happen.
Right.
I just think that flexibility is like what Scott said and what Liz said. Flexibility is so important because the planning board is, and certainly their staff gets so hamstrung on words that are in these master plans, and understandably in some situations, and it's so easy to not create that problem by providing the flexibility so that they can comprehensively look at this.
Pam, was there a lot of testimony on behalf of the development community on this point?
No, we didn't hear. I don't think we got any.
Okay. Well, you're getting it now.
Yeah, well, it would help if it went straight to the council, by the way. I would love it if you would send something in. That would be great, because if you send something in new, I can bring it up in my staff report. If I have a unanimous decision from the committee, while I can still bring it up, it's more like staff pushing their own agenda versus representing what the committee decided. But if I get new testimony.
When would you need new testimony to get in your next staff report?
Probably in the next week. It'll be the staff report that's done for the 28th. And it actually has to get done by like next Wednesday because of the Thanksgiving break.
Full council then?
Yeah. Full council on the 28th, yes.
Great.
Just a general comment on underground utilities. I'm not an expert on this, but I've always felt the county needs to address the problem more holistically. Right now, it's case by case, and you have to preserve that to allow the applicant to go in and argue for the in feasibility sometimes, because
Right.
that sometimes does make the difference. But if undergrounding is a common good of the county, and theoretically results in cost savings of maintaining the system, that needs to be credited towards the applicant. And I don't think it is. I think the applicant pays the full cost of undergrounding and doesn't get credit later on for the cost savings of the maintenance side. And I feel like that needs to be addressed so that you're not penalizing financially the applicant. Instead, you are, softening that gap between costs by recognizing the cost savings later.
Or acknowledging the fact that that's effectively a proffer underneath the development plan, and that perhaps other things might be traded off against. I mean, that's the other challenges, right? It is a public benefit, it's a long-term public benefit, but it's not acknowledges the continued effort to push 10 pounds of stuff in and see what sticks. And the problem is that is a great public benefit that should be perhaps offset against something else.
Scott, did you want the last word?
Yes, just, Stuart's getting at kind of something that we'll be presenting when you go to the AGP growth policy, credits for undergrounding, similar to impact taxes, because it is a benefit beyond the property itself, and it should be credited that way. And there was interesting testimony, Justice Bauman can speak to this, that if the reliability of the whole system was one of the reasons that staff recommended undergrounding, not related to the project's nexus for utility use. So query, is there a constitutional issue there?
Interesting.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you guys. I'm going to leave you this. This is
Thank you.
the full list of recommendations from the state working group, just a
Great.
printed copy. So
Thank
you have
you
that.
so much.
Because I mentioned them in general, but
You have it electronically?
yes, I can send it.
Send it to Brian, and Brian can distribute it to everybody on the.
Thank you so much.
Thank
I'll also see if I
Good
can.
luck.
Good
All right. See you guys.
All right, we're ready now to roll with part 2, zoning.
Hello, everybody. Nice to see familiar faces, new people. Again, my name is Livhu Ndou. I am the legislative attorney for the county council. So the way central staff works is we have our analysts like Pam and Stephen, who each have their subject matter areas. And then we have 4 legislative attorneys. The other 3 are generalists, but because land use and zoning is so complicated, I focus exclusively on that portfolio, which mostly means I write all the ZTAs. So today I'm just gonna give you a rundown of recent ones that passed, ones we have upcoming. I feel like this is a good transition to something you said, where what I always tell the council members is zoning is very, you can write the ZTA and then just hope something happens. So it's very, if you build it, you hope they come.
And the ZTA is a zoning text amendment.
Yes, thank you.
Which is a way of literally amending the zoning ordinance legislatively so that you can change the words of a particular zone, and then that would apply countywide.
Yes. So I basically eat, sleep, and breathe the zoning ordinance all day. And that is another thing that is important. A lot of ZTAs come about because a developer or a community member approaches a council member about an issue. And the first thing I tell them is we can't do special legislation. So can this apply countywide? Are you sure this isn't just for one project? So that the county attorney's office does not call me. So the first one we did earlier this year was ZTA 2302, which was originally a mixed use ZTA. And what ended up happening as we got through committee and then to council is it originally was going to be you had to provide certain thresholds of affordability and 2 non-residential uses. And we got a lot of feedback from the affordable housing community saying, this is impossible, it's not going to work, no one's going to use this. And the committee went back and forth because obviously the council really wants more like mixed use environments. We have a lot of food deserts, a lot of areas where there's a lot of housing, but nothing else. In the end, after a few amendments, what happened is it became the mixed income housing communities ZTA, and the non-residential requirement basically became an option. So you can still do the 2 non-residential uses, but it's no longer required. So that was something we did earlier in the year. It was really similar to the biohealth ZTA that Councilmember Friedson did last year, where you basically get an expedited process through planning because the affordability thresholds are like pretty high. So it's not like an everyday project. So in exchange for that, you get to go through the planning board much quicker. I believe it's 60 days. Yeah, it's pretty quick.
So this is for a mixed income project, basically?
Yeah,
Or
so,
providing, like, is it a certain number of units at a certain threshold? Is it the entire project at a certain like, I guess I'm not familiar with this one. This is.
yeah, so we did something a little new, and I'm sorry I don't have the numbers in front of me, but we did basically 4 levels. It's basically a menu. So there's 4 different options. And so if it's 9% LIHTC, then that counts. And then I believe the first is, the way the other 3 work is they take deeply, deeply affordable versus like our standard MPDU rate. So let's say if 30% of your units have to be affordable, but 15% of those are affordable to like 40% AMI. Because the other thing we have been looking at, which I'm sure DHCA and planning will be working on in the next year or 2, is looking at our MPDU standards, because some people argue that affordability is like not really that affordable, and we're not getting enough of the like deeply, deeply like low AMI levels. So it's basically going to be an option. There's 4 different options for affordability with different numbers.
And MPDU, that's the
moderately priced
dwelling unit ordinance, which is, again, when you build housing of a certain number of units, then 12% or 15% must be falling under moderately priced dwelling units of the overall density that you provide with housing. So it's important. And AMI is a way of measuring income levels to determine if a person qualifies for, quote, an MPDU housing unit, for example.
Yeah, and I think, let's see if I remember. Last time I checked, I think the AMI in Montgomery County, actually someone here might know this, I want to say it was like 140 for a household of 4 or something.
140.
Yeah, $140,000.
Yeah.
A year for a household of 4. That's 100%. So then when we're talking about, exactly, yeah.
For a family of 4.
Yeah.
Right, so that's how that program works. It's by ordinance, and then the regulations are promulgated by the county executive, the executive branch, Department of Housing. They come up with the detailed regulations about how the program will work, and so developers who want to build in the county have to follow that.
Yeah, and I think it's, I want to say it's third, if you have 30 units or more, you have to do that 12%. So for these ZTAs to get this expedited approval, you have to do at least double that and also more deeply affordable. Yeah, I think the lowest one is at least 30%. Yeah. So that was earlier this year. Again, the county is very interested in ways to do mixed use. So if any developers have any ideas for how we can encourage that, that is always welcome, because I know that was a disappointment to some with that ZTA. The next one was ZTA 2303. This is for the Bethesda overlay zone. And this granted, so originally you had to have your building permit, basically gave an additional 1 year to have a building permit, because we had, because of COVID and financial issues and just the way the economy's been the last few years, people's building, they were having their planning board approvals expire before they could get to that building permit, which is honestly kind of a waste of county resources, because then you have to sort of start the whole process over. So we gave a one-time, 1-year extension as of, I believe it was July. If you had an approval by July 17th, 2023, then you get a 1-year extension to go get that building permit. This is only for the Bethesda overlay zone.
Now, this is downtown Bethesda, yes?
Yes, so the Bethesda, it's just where the overlay zone is, so not the whole.
Wasn't it it was an extension just to apply for the building permit, not to actually receive it?
Yes, this was a little bit of wordsmithing on my predecessor's part. This was a Jeff Science special. So to have a building permit in this context meant that you had to have a building permit application accepted by DPS. So not approved yet, but they had to at least be like, we received it, it is complete. And that's the core and the shell of the principal building. So the idea being, once you've had that, you're ready to start getting shovels in the ground. And, you know, we had a little pushback on that one as well, because, you know, one of the reasons that there is a time limit in there is there's only so much density in Bethesda, which I know is an issue that's going to be coming up before the PHP committee. And so the idea is we don't want people to be hoarding that density. We want you to get that approval and get to building as fast as you can. But yeah, giving that 1-year extension, because, you know, things have been tough financially for the developers, and the council acknowledged that.
Was there any discussion in connection with that about giving an extra year? So there's 2 triggers, right? The first is to kind of get your application for building permit accepted. The second trigger is you actually have to pull the building permit.
Yes.
Within another time frame. When you guys were doing that ZTA, was there any discussion about giving an extra year for that second phase of the trigger?
It did come up when I was drafting the
That's what I was
ZTA.
getting at.
Yep, it came up when I was drafting the ZTA, and I will be honest, the truth is, there was a little pushback on even just doing the 1 deadline. And so in the end, the council member was like, we're just gonna do it, we're gonna go with the 1 deadline, we're not gonna do the second one yet. I think there's been some concern, particularly with the last council, that we were giving just like a lot of extensions on things, and there was a bit of like, all right, developers, you're holding this land, you gotta start building. So yeah, it did come up, but they chose to do just that first deadline.
Do you think, given the state of the economy and the credit crunch and all that, it's worse now than it was
Right.
when that zoning text amendment came up, that there would be an appetite to revisit that issue? Because there are people that are concerned about
that are like shovel ready.
Yeah, they just can't get financing.
I think what's gonna end up happening, because a conversation that went alongside this, which I won't say avoided, but tried not to focus on too much because we were so focused on the deadline, is planning is saying that we are actually running out of density in the bus. I think last I spoke to them, they said, you know, in the next year or two, that density cap, we're gonna hit it and there won't be any left.
For downtown Bethesda.
For downtown Bethesda. Yeah, and for just the overlay zone. And so I think, I want to say actually sometime this fall, the PHP committee, if not in January, is going to be discussing like, what do we do next? Should we raise that cap? Because one thing that happened here is, I think originally the developer who'd requested this had asked for a 2-year extension. And planning said, we can't give a 2-year extension because we have projects in the pipeline. And if everybody who's already been approved gets a 2-year extension, then we're going to hit that cap immediately. So I think that conversation would probably have to happen, because we've kind of put it off for this CCA. I think that conversation about the cap would have to happen before another extension happened.
And can you remind folks who are listening,
So
that?
don't ask me the number, I won't know.
No, but I was trying to, if you could remind folks who on the council sits on the planning and housing committee.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So Andrew Friesen is the chair, and then it's Councilmember Jawando and Councilmember Natalie Fanning Gonzalez are our new, which I also keep calling it Fed, but it's the PHP committee. I'll say I made a push to call it Fizz, because I think the word zoning should be in there, but I was overruled. And I think Fizz just sounds more fun. So yeah, so that was the Bethesda overlay zone ZTA, which I think they adopted back in June. Next is a smaller one. I almost didn't put on the list, but it is kind of business related. Councilmember Albernoz did a ZTA to allow more commercial vehicle parking in residential zones. We had a lot of smaller businesses, a lot of landscapers. The way it worked is you could have one light commercial vehicle and one recreational vehicle. And we had households where people would have like 2 trucks they use for business. And that actually had quite a bit of support, because it gets those commercial vehicles off the street, which the council gets many, many emails about trying to get vehicles off the street. So the change there was you can have 1 light and 1 recreational vehicle, or you can have 2 light commercial vehicles. And so.
This came up last night in the legislative priorities hearing for the delegation.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. So yeah, it was I will say I love some ZTAs more than others, and this is one that I really loved. So I was like, it's easy, it's a quick write, and it makes a lot of sense. And it doesn't increase the total number of vehicles. I should say this was in the R 200, 90, 60, and 40 zones. And then there was an amendment towards the end to add that to the ARR and rural zones as well.
So that's.
If you take your work vehicle home.
Yeah, so you can take your work vehicle home and park it in your driveway. Yeah.
So that is most of the residential zones.
Yeah.
In the county.
Yeah. So pretty big change, I think, for the everyday person walking down their street. And so that's that one. And now, so that is ZTAs that have passed, and now I'm going to go to ZTAs that are coming up. So 2306 is the Fenton Village Overlay Zone. This is a site plan ZTA. That public hearing is November 28th. So if you want to testify or submit a letter, that's the deadline there. So in the Fenton Village Overlay Zone.
This is an area of downtown Silver Spring.
Yes, yep.
Right.
So the way that overlay zone was written in the zoning ordinance, all developments have to go through site plan. And we have we had 2 or 3 projects come forward, approach council members saying they're doing pretty minor changes. Do they have to go through the whole site plan process? And so what the ZTA is going to do, it's going to exempt certain developments from having to go through site plan approval. They'll still have to follow all the development standards in the underlying zone, which I will say over and over at work session. It's not like we're taking away every standard. We're not taking away every process. You just don't have to do a full site plan approval. And the changes that are going to be allowed is any addition, reconstruction, or alteration that is 1 story up to a maximum of 15 feet, and that changes the gross floor area by less than 1,000 square feet. So that's how that ZTA is going to play out.
Move to 1 million square feet?
No. I was actually surprised we got 1,000 square feet.
Add a couple of zeros.
Add some zeros.
We did get a question of, will people use this over and over? So like, will they say, I'm going to add a floor,
Right, and then another
next year add a back, add an addition, and then the next year add another floor.
So
So
it really is true. It's a minor stuff.
it's pretty minor project.
Like housing.
Yeah, for the most part. Or like, I think there's like a 1-story business that like wants an additional story, that idea.
Well, you could also then, to your point about doing this serially, doing it on a commercial basis might be cost effective. On a residential basis, this will never be cost effective. The worst way to add on to your house is to add on and add on and add on.
Right.
I think you could basically count on the fact that if somebody's doing that on the residential basis,
You're not going to do this
it's
over and
not- it's
over.
not- The commercial component, I think, would be fair if that was the concern, is to perhaps suggest that this is really a residential component, to let it slide. If you're worried about the commercial side, say, except for commercial applications, you can only do it once.
Right.
Right, so that would be a way.
That could be another
around it.
solution as well, yeah. And I mean, I'm trying to think, the Fenton Village overlay, like, those aren't huge lots.
They're tiny.
So once you add those setbacks into,
Is nothing.
it's not a lot. It's
nothing.
really not a lot.
It's-
So,
Yes, I know.
yeah. It does remind me, I do often say, like, most of being a zoning attorney is being like, okay, here's the worst case scenario, maybe 2 people will do it. So figuring out the balance between not making things so strict no one will use it, but also like flexible enough to be useful.
And only in Montgomery County would adding a few thousand more square feet of commercial development be considered a worst case. You see, only in Montgomery County. No other jurisdiction would think that, but yes.
We have diligent neighbors in Montgomery County. So the next one, and I'm going to say right now, I'm a lawyer because I don't like math. The next one is the Bethesda Overlay Zone, the PIP, the Park Improvement Payments, and then the Civic Improvement Funds in Silver Spring. I should have done this one before Pam left. So what this is going to do is earlier in the year, the council did a bill to change the way they were calculating the impact tax. And it's just going to take that same change and apply it to those 2 overlay zones. Like, that's all that happening. I keep pretending to call it a technical correction, even though I know it doesn't feel that way to people. But we're not changing the way the overlay zones work at all. Just the change that we did in that bill to the impact tax, because we found out the calculations were kind of off, apply those same changes to these overlay zones because they had that same language. We would have done them at the same time, but there was actually a deadline for that bill where it had to pass by July 1. So the way it worked is, okay, I'm just going to read it exactly so I don't mess this up. It modified the calculation for the adjustments for school and transportation taxes, established a 20% inflation cap on the development impact tax rate, and it allowed any excess dollars over the cap to be carried over and added to the following year. So basically, it's going to use a cumulative inflation instead of the like averaging of every 2 years. I will say we do expect some opposition to this one because it's are two very popular overlay zones. But again, it's just applying what we had done in the code generally to the zoning ordinance.
I don't have this on you, but do you have a sense of what it does to the actual per square foot numbers?
Actually, I do, because someone emailed me and asked. Okay. I asked Lisa Devoni in planning, and so she was saying, so right now, let's say 2021, the average annual was $11.41, and I think in 2023, she said it was going to be $12.49. So she said
For the PIP payment.
you have a slightly higher dollar amount for the PIP payment.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the PIP, not the TIF.
Is that retroactive, or does that just now apply to everybody?
It'll now apply going forward, and I actually need to double check the dates because it only changes certain years, so it actually might not, it probably won't go into effect until next year, and I have to remember which one uses odd numbers, which one of them uses odd years and the other uses even years.
Well, but the
When
point
you
is,
pay for it.
well, but I guess that's why I was asking the question, is it based on when you pull the density, or is it when it's based on when you've gotten your
It
building
gets
permit?
set until you actually pay.
So when you
check
pay
the
it,
building
I
permit.
mean, it's just sort of like impact taxes.
You can roll
Okay. I was asking, I
Yeah.
didn't know how it was written, you know?
Yeah, I shouldn't say this, but it's a copy paste of the impact tax language, is how it was put into the ZTA originally, so.
The fact that it's gonna, for people who haven't pulled the density, it's
Mhm.
the, and it's
Additional
it's a
additional
10%
cost.
Additional cost, it's
Yeah.
about a 10% additional cost
Right.
of the density,
Yeah,
right? 9, 10.
yeah. I know the numbers matter, but I do hate math, so. All right, two more. These are my agricultural reserve ZTAs that I'm very excited about. So the first is, I know, I shouldn't say that because I don't love having to do agricultural reserve ZTAs. So the first is 2308. This is about the TDR program. So there's a whole, that's transferable development rights, where, farmers in the AR zone can basically give up some of their density and sell it to developers to get that extra density. This is a very basic way to explain it.
One house.
You're saying, what density are we talking about?
Yeah.
One or two houses. And if it's two, that's 100% more than one. So to a council member, you've got 100% more. But we're talking about two houses. I don't know math either, by the way.
I did, I think Pam actually worked on this one, but we did a whole OLO, our Office of Legislative Oversight does studies periodically, per council member's request, and there was one on the entire TDR, BLT program. Is it working? What's left? Is there even anything left to buy, left to sell? Do we get rid of it? So there's a beautiful long OLO report if you want to read up on it. But in the zoning ordinance, there's a long list of things you can't do on that land that's encumbered by a TDR. Basically, if you have that easement, you just can't build certain things. And one of those things was a cemetery. And so this is Councilmember Balcom's ZTA, where there's, a couple cemeteries that just want to expand their existing cemetery onto the neighboring parcel, which has this TDR on it. So what this will do is cemeteries are not going to come off the list completely, but if all you're doing is expanding a cemetery, you can go on to that TDR lot now. And so that'll be a change that sounds small, but is actually pretty big. I will say on the technical side, cemeteries are a conditional use. So the application process is going to be a little funny because what will probably happen is if it's a cemetery that already exists, they'll need to go to the Board of Appeals and do a major modification is how that will work. That language isn't in the ZTA, but because it's an existing cemetery, that's how conditional use expansions work.
The ZTA is not intended to add to the list of uses prohibited if the ag property is encumbered by a TDR easement. Is that correct?
Correct. It is the ZTA. It was a lot of writing on my part. It is 4 words. So yeah, it's like cemetery, comma, if it is an expansion, basically. There was some discussion of whether cemeteries should come off the list, whether we should be looking at cemeteries differently. There's, we need cemeteries, but everybody doesn't want to live next to a cemetery necessarily. There were questions about, why was this on the list in the first place? And the answer was, because some people think it preserves the rural open space nature of this area. But on the other hand, once you put cemetery there, you definitely can't farm there. So you're taking up farmland. So it's that balance we always have with the ag reserve is.
That's only if you know it, like what you've dealt with is all known cemeteries.
This is true.
Agricultural plots have had out for generations and may not be aware of the fact.
That is a brilliant
Well, there are
point.
two kinds of cemeteries. I don't know if you and the council are getting into that, but there's two kinds. There's commercial cemeteries, the ones that people are used to going to.
Mhm.
And then there are what are called family cemeteries,
Right.
which generally occur in rural America. They're everywhere in rural America, and it's a family cemetery. And there's a big difference between the two.
There's a big difference, and I think in the zoning ordinance definition of cemetery, I will double check this, but I think it excludes like just a family like lot.
Cemetery.
And so we know when I last checked with planning, they said there were 79 burial sites in the AR zone, and I followed up with them to say, that's great, but what I really need is how many like cemetery use and occupancy permits, like official to DPS cemeteries are there, because that's who this would apply to. So it's a technical definition question.
A handful.
Yeah, I doubt there's very many. I mean, I can't imagine there's too many, so.
Can I ask an interpretation question about that general part of the
Yeah.
Zoning ordinance? So you have the list of uses prohibited if the property is encumbered by TDR easement.
Mm-hmm.
You have a number of TDRs that are dependent on the size. If you encumber the property with only a portion of the TDRs, are you then not able to have any of the uses that are prohibited? Or do you have to basically have stripped all of your?
I believe it's written as only on the portion that has the TDR easement.
So typically, if you have an overall property
Mm-hmm.
and you're only wanting to sever some of the TDRs, not all the available ones,
Mm-hmm.
you record the easement against the property saying, I have X number of TDRs, but I'm creating a fraction of those to sell. So it doesn't, like if you want to strip 50% of your TDRs and sell them, you don't encumber half the property. You put an easement over the entire property and you just say in the easement document, I have X number of TDRs and I'm creating half of those to sell. So when you do a portion like that, are you then restricted with all the uses that are prohibited then? Or do you happen to know if you have to have severed all of them?
Right. The way it's written in the zoning ordinance is, I believe it says a lot or parcel encumbered by a TDR.
Correct. But you record that against the entire property.
Right. So in the zoning ordinance, they only talk about the literal parcel that is encumbered instead of saying the word property. Does that answer your question?
I suspect, just given how the county typically interprets the zoning ordinance, they would say, the county would say that
DPS.
all the uses are prohibited at that point, but I've never been sure of that, whether that's the correct interpretation.
Right. I would, if DPS were to call me, I would say it says lot or parcel, not entire property. And, lot, parcel, and property all have their own three separate definitions. So that's how I would interpret it. The unfortunate part of my job is I write all the laws, but I don't get to interpret any of them. So typically what I do when I write a ZTA is I will call DPS and say, here's what I wrote, here's what I intended. Are you going to read it this way? So I believe with this one, we met with the zoning and code compliance section, which is Victor Salazar is the chief of that. And I often talk to ASON.
Okay.
Yeah, Patricia Wolford as well. Yeah, so those are the three, sometimes Linda Kobleski, those are the usual points of contact. And that part of it, we weren't changing. We were just changing the cemetery piece, but that's a good question. I can definitely follow up on that. Because another thing is, right now it's saying you're expanding a cemetery, and I'm sure there'll be a question of expanding where? Does that mean they have to be adjacent? Can I own a parcel here and then another parcel across the street? Does that count as an expansion? And right now the ZTA is silent on that. And I think sometimes we leave it a little more flexible to say we're not saying that you can't do that, but I'm sure that's a question that will come up as well. Because also adjacent, abutting, and confronting have three separate definitions. So I can't just say they're near each other. We have to sort of pick a word. Sometimes we'll say separated by a right-of-way is one that I like to use. Okay, so the last one, which I think is the biggest one, is 2309. This is Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez's ZTA about outdoor stays. There's many pieces here.
Outdoor what?
Outdoor stays.
Stays?
Yeah, so it's an agritourism overnight stay.
Oh, stay.
Oh, S-T.
Oh, S-T-A-Y, not stays.
Well, that's why I want to be clear. I don't
Oh,
want
it's
to.
overnight accommodations.
I don't want to cause confusion. S-T-A-Y-S.
S-T-A-Y-S.
So the idea of a bed and breakfast idea?
Not quite.
Not quite, okay.
So I should have brought a slideshow for this one. So what's gonna happen is, so say you're already doing farming. So start with farming, that's the umbrella, because you're in the AR zone. You have to already be doing farming. That must be the primary use. So accessory to that, you are doing agritourism, which I always flag this. The word agritourism is not actually in the zoning ordinance. It's accessory, agricultural, and education activities. And that is your hay rides, your corn mazes.
So the butler's orchard
The farm
idea.
stuff. True, but not breweries and wineries, which are a separate section of the zoning ordinance.
Because it's liquor.
Because it's liquor.
Farm alcohol production.
Yeah, so
Right.
farm alcohol production, it's not that piece,
Okay.
it's the agritourism piece. You could still be doing both. You could be doing all those things. But this part is specifically written in the code underneath the agritourism section. So what you will be allowed to do, still accessory to farming, so however that is interpreted, I mean, depending which judge you ask, some people say less than 49%, or AG might say, we know it when we see it. So however you define accessory, you will be able to have 10 separate structures, separate from the primary dwelling. They can have 2 adults max. I don't know if you guys watched the short-term residential rental Airbnb work sessions that the committee and council had. But something that often comes up is we put limits on adults, and people are like, so you can have infinite children, and the council's policy is yes. So we are a family-friendly county. We're not going to tell you how many children, so we only place the caps on number of adults. I think for this one in particular that matters, because generally children do not drive. So we won't have traffic concerns if you put a cap on the number of adults. So you can have these 10 separate structures, 2 adults each. Picture a yurt, a mini cabin. Again, they don't have to be huge because it's, you know, only 2 adults. They can operate 4 days a week, which I'm going to probably suggest an amendment to say 4 days, 3 nights, to clarify what 4 days means. Because they are not dwelling units, because that leads to other zoning problems, they cannot have cooking facilities. A question that's going to come up, which you probably are all about to ask, is what about well and septic? Met with DPS about this. They said, listen, well and septic, that's up to the applicant. If they want to put toilets in each of them, they're going to have to go through that process. If they'd rather have a separate sanitation facility, they'll go through that process. Like, basically they said, either works, but like that'll be up to the applicant. And so we didn't dictate that in the ZTA. Does not mean that that's not going to change, because I already know people who are going to suggest an amendment saying no bathrooms in the structures either. So yeah, that is or I believe it's called incidental outdoor stays. And the only reason for that name is there was a change in state law recently that said that this counts as agritourism, and that's the word they use, and I am not going to reinvent the wheel.
So beyond water, what about electric, gas, cable? Just asking the question.
Yeah, so, great question.
Why can't we get around it on
But
well and septic?
as-
What about all the other utilities?
Well,
Yeah.
as long as you underground everything.
Well, no, when you solar, so we earlier got to put up solar, right? Because solar, I'm just asking the question, does solar allow you to do Wi-Fi and a whole bunch? I mean, okay.
This is going to be a pretty fun work session, I think, because it's going to be a lot of what are all the loopholes. This will be the worst case scenario type of ZTA. The proposals we've gotten, because there's been 2 or 3 developers who've reached out and want to do this. It's something.
Developers or farmers?
I won't clarify. And, you know, there was a agritourism study, was it last year? I think it was last year. The Econ Committee discussed it last week, where it was something in the study of if we want to bring people to the county, they're going to come out, visit these places, and then there's nowhere to stay out there. So this gives people somewhere to stay. In terms of utilities, from the plans I've seen, ideas I've heard, some probably will have gas and electric, some might not. Right now, it's pretty flexible to how the person building them wants to do it, as long as the majority of the land is for farming. So I should say the majority of the use, not the majority of the land, because that's not the same. So
There you
yeah,
go.
so right now,
Okay.
yes, that would be
Okay.
allowed.
Very
What was
interesting.
the driving force of kind of the 3-night, 4-day stay threshold cutoff?
So the idea was to make sure that it really stays accessory, that you're not just running these 10, that you're not just running this sort of overnight stay and not doing the farming anymore. So it helps keep it accessory, also helps with the neighborhood impact, because that'll be something people are definitely gonna write in about.
One thing
Sure, I just think about like a 2-day, a 4-day weekend or whatever, something like that, like,
Mhm.
it just seems like the 3, I'm just curious.
You have to leave a day early.
Arbitrary. Yeah.
Well, the challenge is obviously, what if you allowed for a 7-day week? How do you know that somebody actually ever leaves?
Well, you can still, I mean,
That's why I have no issue
have
with
a
the 4.
maximum
Right,
of-
you
That's why I have no issue with the 4-day, and I would
Unless the
think,
county's inspecting the books.
Yeah, I will say this one, I mean, like any time, there's a limit on days of the week. What I say is this just becomes an enforcement question.
Yeah.
Because it means that we need to know that, like, how will we prove? I know for example, for the short-term residential rentals, you have to have a guest register. So if DPS shows up, you have to show them the guest register and they see how many people stayed. But yeah, the intent behind it was to keep it accessory and to reduce some of the neighborhood impact.
In the ag reserve, I'm just curious, has all the solar use legislation, is that done, basically? We get calls periodically and a little, gun shy about like, what's the flavor of the month on this issue? Like, is it resolved? Is it?
I would not say it's resolved. I'll tell you a little personal work story is, so I started 3 years ago, and so I started January 2021, I believe it was. Yeah. And there were 2 big VTAs that Jeff left before he finished. One was 5G, one was solar collection systems. I was like, great, nice, easy ones. So I focused on 5G while Pam finished off the solar one because it was mostly done. And as you know, there were a lot of amendments at the end based on soil types. And last I heard, we have received applications for, I think, 2 projects since that passed. So a lot of people aren't happy about that, that basically the ZTA did what I warned about in the beginning, where we wrote it and nothing actually happened.
Duh.
On top of that, I think the state has passed at least 7 or 8 different bills about solar since we passed that ZTA. They preempt us in a lot of ways, which, is good or bad depending what side you're on. I know we have at least 2 applications in right now that are working their way through planning and DPS. I believe the decision is we're going to treat them like mandatory referral, actually. The solar projects where we're completely preempted, but they still have to check forest conservation and all of that. And then lastly, planning is supposed to give, as part of the original ZTA, basically a report to council saying, all right, we passed this ZTA, what projects have we gotten? Is it working? What should we change? And that is due in December. So I will tell you any questions or requests I get from council members about solar projects, what we do, I say, let's see what the report says, and then we can get to work on it. But it is definitely an issue that is live and ongoing, and we still get
And that report is coming out in December, next month?
I believe it's this year,
And what do we look for? What's it called, the impact of?
I actually don't know what they're gonna title it. I don't think we told them what they had to call it. But likely there will probably be I'm gonna say PHP committee briefing on it. We have a lot of committee now, and sometimes the question of what goes to what committee. So probably there'll be a PHP committee briefing on it. Possibly, it might be joint T&E since they're the environment.
Okay.
And I mean, right now, the report will be pretty thin because we've only received 2 projects. So I do suspect some changes to that part of the zoning ordinance. It'll just be a question of what, because I know on my end, it's a lot of where are we preempted. Usually it's the megawattage, I believe it's 2 megawatts.
Yeah.
It's pretty low. So literally anything over 2, we can't say no. So So yeah, that should be interesting.
Today's ZTA, so is the idea that you can do that use even if the property has a TDR easement on it?
Yeah, actually, I think even if you had a TDR, you could still be able to, because they're not dwelling units. Which I will keep saying.
In other words, because they're accessory uses?
They're accessory uses. One thing that was added to the ZTA right before introduction, very proud of myself for catching this, is there's a limit on accessory structures. And the way it works in the AR zone is if the building is used for farming, you don't need a building permit. But these are obviously not being used for farming. So these will be exempt from the accessory structure limit, which I believe is 50% of the size of the principal building, which would obviously not work for this. So they'll be exempt.
You would have to go to DPS for permits on those buildings. You couldn't get them if or.
So this was an interesting question. I did talk to DPS, and they said this is fine, but you're still going to need to comply with like fire code and safety and all of that. So yeah, so you
through a DPS review.
Yeah, so you're very likely going to need a building permit. Also, because of the size of these, I suspect some of them might go through planning as well. So
The size?
because there'll be 10, it's because you're doing these 10 structures. Originally, we thought about whether they should have to subdivide, and generally we didn't want to have to, we didn't want to.
On the size of the structure?
There's not a limit on the size of the structure. There's no limits on the size of the structure, the type of the structure. One question I did get is whether RVs count. This is another definition thing. An RV is not a structure, it's a recreational vehicle. So technically it is separate from this. And right now, if you have over 2 acres in the AR zone, you can have as many recreational vehicles as you want. So they don't even need the CTA. So,
well, it's,
yeah.
Hey, it's RV agritourism.
Well, again, if you're not going to limit, quote, the number of children, the structure could be quite large. Because you're going to have a lot of kids with an adult or two.
You could.
Right, right. Right, this is going to
So
attract.
when you go do agritourism, are you working on the farm? What are you doing?
Or like the Pennsylvania farm stays or
Yeah.
things like that where you're.
Do like a hayride, a little pumpkin patch, you're apple picking.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Butler's is the best example,
Right,
probably.
Butler's Orchard, that,
Where you are a working, operating farm,
right.
but, you know, we want to help the farmers thrive and bring people to the area. So you're farming, but you're bringing people in.
I think my only suggestion would be, or one of them would be, I think you said it's limited just to like a couple. I mean, if a couple wants to bring a small child or a baby, what's the problem with that? They want to get away, they want to.
No, they're not limiting.
They're not limiting kids. So it's 2 adults per structure,
But you could be 12,
Structure.
but there's no limit on the number of kids, yeah.
well, what they're going to do,
Tactical limitation.
There's no limits on children. Yes, no limits on children.
No bedroom, bunkhouse.
You can bring the kids.
You can bring the kids,
Not to say you would want to, but.
but you could if you wanted
You
to.
can have the babysitter.
Right.
Yes, yes.
and you can do this. And this will go through unbelievable review by the council with incredible review and amendments
We're
and
gonna spend
everything.
a lot of time on the agritourism one. What about
Right.
things that are important to possibly the commercial sector, looking at what I would expect to be coming headwinds for office occupancy, turning buildings back in, need to adaptively reuse almost anything and everything within the next several years. And recognizing the fact that, I don't know, perhaps that sort of economic engine might be as or more important than, no disrespect to agritourism, but making sure that our office building stock, if it's not utilized, could possibly be converted to residential. If buildings that are at or near the end of their useful life could be quickly adaptively reused to something else.
Well, I think the point is, that globally, seriously, in all seriousness, is if you have a good idea and it requires an amendment to the zoning ordinance to get to that good idea, this is the person you go talk about it with, because she knows where the dangers might be, the loopholes might be, and you work with the council members, you begin to see where some of them are coming from. But no, your point is well taken, and sometimes it requires an amendment to the way a zone is written, there's no doubt about it, and this is who you go to.
Yeah, I would say I have no pending ZTAs on those issues. A lot of times the ZTA comes about because someone says, there's a project that I want to do, I'm ready to do it, and your code doesn't let me.
You're about to be seeing a lot of this, is my guess. The office building's handed back where somebody says, I can't use this office building for residential, how do I convert it? I've got this building that wants to be this, I need to take this down and modify X, Y, and Z. And the county's ability to adapt to that need or opportunity is going to be huge. That's my prediction in the next 4 years. And getting ahead of this with the ZTA and by the way, the problem is this is development. Everything is going to be a little bit different. What works for this person is going to work for that person, but we need to start figuring out how we can perhaps change and modify existing uses into something else so that we can, want to meet a housing need head on, figure out how to convert an old office building into affordable housing.
Sounds like good content for a future committee meeting.
It's great content, but that in schools, right? I mean, you've seen whole jurisdictions, you can't build a school, let's buy an old office building. And then now you start thinking it's a vertical school. You have to start thinking about things differently, but that's where we should be thinking as a county.
And I will say what helps on my end in particular is, if someone comes to me with an idea or a council member says, we have this problem, what do we do to fix it? Because for me, the zoning ordinance is my Bible. What I need to know is what on the development end in the zoning ordinance is stopping you from doing that. So for example, we had a big senior housing ZTA a year or two ago. And they were saying, we want to do these independent living facilities, but in these zones, we can only do single family dwellings. How do we do an apartment? And so it was an easy way for me to see, oh, okay, what your issue is we need to figure out a way that you can build a multi-unit living structure in these zones for senior living. So it's that, here's the broad problem, but what part of the zoning ordinance is stopping us from doing it? Is where the changes on my end come in. As you heard from Pam, on her end, it's what in the master plan needs to change to encourage this so that people will make these changes.
And one thing is that when you think about, because I'm glad you raised the master plan point, now that the Thrive 2050 general plan has been approved and adopted, we have these older master plans, which are out there pre-new general plan. And so it's going to take some adjustment to update those. And I think the argument to be made by all of us, everyone here, is if there's a conflict between an old master plan and the new general plan, you push hard on, it's the general plan that should be guiding public policy and the ordinances that need amending.
Yeah.
And you don't have to wait for an amendment to an old master plan. This is the argument I would make from a policy point of view and from a legal point of view. From a law point of view, the new general plan lays out the policies, and to get to more development, more this, more that, in a better place or that place, what's going to happen from what you're saying is that people who don't want something to happen will point to their area plan, which was adopted 10 or 20 years ago, and say, wait, there's nothing in here about that, you can't do it. And I think the planning board is primed, and hopefully the council is primed to say, no, we have a new general plan, that's the policy. It's just something I would think about as you work on the zoning side of things.
Yeah, it's a nice handy thing in the land use article.
Are you finding, being the zoning specialist stuff at the
Oh, boy.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
The only reason they had science do it is because his last name began with Z.
Oh, okay.
Are you finding that, the council members, they sort of, the lingo up there is we want things to happen, we want development to happen, we want economic development, we don't want to be a roadblock, right?
Right.
And so that's sort of what you hear when they're pounding the pavements on the street and all that kind of stuff.
Going door to door.
But then there's this just insatiable urge when legislation gets in front of them to pick it apart and to tighten it up. I'm not even sure they realize they're doing that.
No, they don't.
To tighten it up and to think of, to have you try to think of every iteration to make it so that it's bulletproof. And bulletproof is often not the friend of flexibility because it makes it so tight that that you're on a straitjacket, basically.
Right.
So how do you, in sort of a subtle, nudge, do you sort of try to remind them that, hey, we're trying to make something happen and we're trying to provide flexibility as opposed to being so tight? I'm listening to this discussion on the ag reserve stuff, and I haven't done stuff in the ag reserve in a long time.
It's always a
Most
hot
of my
button
work
area.
is, you're looking at it out the window, and it just seems like the level of minutia is mind-boggling in a way.
Yeah. So one thing I love, I should say, I used to do litigation, and I didn't like it because I hated advocating for a side. I could do it. I was a good lawyer, but it pained me to be like, but the other side has a point. So this job is perfect because I get to be like, okay, here's your idea. Here's what the developers are going to say and why they're not going to be able to do this. And sometimes we get a lot of like, we're all going to leave. And I'm like, well, on this one, I don't know. And on the other hand, I also get to say, but here's what the community is going to be mad about. And so I try very hard to present both sides just so I can gain trust with both the council and the development community and the neighborhood groups I have to work with. But particularly with ZTAs, because almost always, it's very rare that we're doing a ZTA because there's something happening in the community that people hate. We're rarely making things stricter. Like usually we're trying to do economic development and bring more people in. So usually the idea starts very broad. And personally, my advice is often when you're getting, because there's many stages of a ZTA, actually this might be helpful. So it gets introduced, and then it gets to public hearing, and then it has the work session, and then it goes to council. And I say at introduction to the council member, do what you think is the perfect ZTA. What do you want this project to look like? What do you want this to look like for the county? What is it you're trying to get from the developers, but also that you want to give them an opportunity to do? And then after we hear that community concern, if you feel the need to pull it back, then maybe do that. Something I do very often in my staff reports, I love maps because I think very often there's this fear of, well, on the one hand, we don't want to do special legislation. So I never want a map that's like, we're doing the ZTA and here's the one property it will affect. So I need at least a few properties on that map. But on the other hand, if sometimes we hear the cemetery one's a good example. Well, then we're just gonna have cemeteries everywhere. And it's like, well, that's not true. So if you look at this map, there's only so many cemeteries. If 10 of them expanded, and by the way, all of them won't, what is the actual impact going to be? Because I, of course, have to tell them what the worst case scenario is going to be. But as Pam said, it's really exhausting to write a ZTA that nobody uses. I can tell you, remember the biohealth ZTA? I spent so many hours on that, and we do not have a project yet. So, it's
we
that.
Tried. we tried, but, and it wasn't for fault of the ZTA.
But yeah, it's that balance between we want to be writing things that are helpful and you want to keep it flexible, but you also don't want all the developers to
One
leave.
other part of the ZTA process that you didn't really mention, but I do think is important, is that the planning board gets a crack at this thing too.
Yes, they do.
And so there is an opportunity to go before the planning board and express your point of view on that and have the board weigh in.
Yeah, which is very helpful, and almost always planning's at the committee work sessions as well and weigh in. I'll bring in whichever agency is relevant, usually it's DPS, to also weigh in. So yeah, I try really hard to present both sides, but emphasize I don't want to have done all this work for nothing. So here's what the developers are going to need. I cannot stress enough how much letters from you guys help. Because I can say something and it's just me saying it, but if I have a letter saying like, here's a letter from Lurch and Early, who we know does a lot of development here, and they are saying they're not going to be able to do this. So for example, that mixed use CTA, we got many letters from affordable housing groups who were like, we won't be able to do this.
Fair enough.
So because that also gives us a little weight, so I don't have HOA saying you just hate us. I can say no, Lurch and Early hates you. No,
And we do this often. We'll do a group letter on the growth policy, and what else we do it on when it was submitted. On the work.
Yeah, the state work group, we got a lot of letters from both, and as you said, that work group happened because of a state bill that a lot of people disagreed with about what to do with the planning department. And then we got many, 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 many letters during that work group saying, please don't move them. And that was very helpful because we could say, you're saying people want this, but we got all these letters saying the opposite. So yeah, balancing those things is definitely a lot of the job.
Well, that's been terrific presentation. You've been so helpful.
Thank
It's
you.
great meeting you.
Yes, you all as well.
Now that you've been here for almost 3 years. Almost 3 years, and having to come here into the county, into this position, from where you came during the pandemic, never easy. But now that things have opened up and getting back to normal, we're so glad you could be here today for just terrific presentation. And again, want to thank everybody. And again, to remind everyone what Brian said, our meeting next month will be with the brand new State Highway Administrator, just
exciting.
newly minted. So until then, at a different time, as Brian said, it is a 9:30 meeting, and it is all virtual. It will not be in this room. So with that, thank you, everybody. Any closing? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
We lost a bunch of people.
No, we're down to two. Chuck and Miller left.
They must have gotten cut off. They couldn't